in today's video, I should talk a little bit more about all these stats counters I have going on in my videos, just to make sure you know what you might want to look at, because VRAM and 1% lows and the frame time graphs are going to be a lot more important than in my normal videos. So here we're looking at the 3060 12GB up against the 4060 Ti 8GB. The 4060 Ti is newer, it's more expensive, and it has less VRAM. A lot of games nowadays use a lot of VRAM. How big of a deal is that? So let's look at some of these stats counters up here. So I'm currently pointing at the VRAM allocation, the amount of VRAM that the game is allocating to the graphics card, but I can also show next to it the per process usage, the amount that the game is actually reporting, at least to my stats program, that it's actually trying to use. Now, the 3060 has 12GB, so it can try to use more than 8. If we fly over to the 4060 Ti, we can see that in the same scene, well, it's not using 8GB of VRAM, it's only allocating 7.5. And then over here, it's only actually reporting a per process usage of a little bit over 6. Well, in that case, what's happening is it's spilling over into system RAM, where I'm also showing I have a 32GB RAM system. In this case, it's allocating about 14.5, but it's reporting a per process usage of 7. Whereas if we fly over to the 3060 12GB, we can see up here, we can see about 11.5GB allocated and only 4.5GB actually reported as per process usage. So what we can see happening here is that because the 4060 Ti does not have more than 8GB of VRAM, the stuff that is going into the VRAM buffer on the 3060 is spilling over into system RAM on the 4060 Ti. And what can that do to your performance? Well, right here, I'm pointing at a spike on the frame time graph. In a video, it can often be, it doesn't really capture the smoothness of a gameplay experience due to capturing issues on, the capture card isn't variable refresh rate, you're watching a locked 60 FPS video, that kind of thing. So the frame time graph, a spike like that would manifest itself as a noticeable stutter if you were actually playing the game. The other issues that can happen that can be a little bit harder to spot when you spill over VRAM is sometimes textures don't load in properly. I'm not seeing that in this particular scene here, but that's another issue that can happen that doesn't necessarily show up in the stats counters or the frame time graphs, but does affect your visual experience. Now, when you're looking at these frame time counters, you can see the current frame rate, the average frame rate so far for the benchmark run, and then the 1% lows. The 1% lows are the lowest 1% of frames through the duration of the benchmark run. And it's spikes like this that will then cause the 1% lows usually to then be more noticeably lower, which is why I'm tracking the relative performance by the end of the benchmark run. In the video, I don't always show you the entire length of the benchmark run. I show you a clip of it, but I give you the average results at the end over on this side of the screen. With all of that explained, I think you guys are now ready to get into looking at the benchmarks. You'll know what to look at. We'll see how much does the 8GB hold back this card. I'll give you some final thoughts on the end about price, because that's the other big deal, is that right now, brand new, if I went somewhere like PC Part Picker that surveys a whole bunch of new listings, the 3060 12GB version can be had brand new for around $280 right now, even though its original MSRP was around $330, and for a long time it was actually selling closer to $400. And the 4060 Ti is actually priced at $400 MSRP, but we're starting to see some models discounted because a lot of people are just hesitant to spend $400 on an 8GB card. Perhaps we'll see some of why, or whether or not that's justified in today's video. But I should also point out, because 3060s have been out for a long time, if you go somewhere like today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, there'll be a link in the description and pinned comment, you could search for a 3060 and maybe get some of these showing up. Let's sort price load high. It looks like we see a model here for around $230 used in good condition. This is just somebody who probably has upgraded. Let's go ahead and check in here. Yeah, it just says it's used like new condition. They hardly used it. They've upgraded to a 4070, so it's good to go. Honestly, for a lot of people, Buying a used GPU, especially once a new generation card has launched, is the way to go. Or also, if you are considering upgrading, you can sell your gear on Jawa.gg. You can buy and sell both used and new stuff here. They get some great options, extremely easy. List it, ship it, get paid. Just that easy. And actually, if you're just tired of this whole building a new PC business, building your own PC, and you just want to grab an entire completed system, they have that as well. Again, check out Jawa.gg to buy and sell your used and new PC hardware. Link in the description and pinned comment. Let's jump into the benchmarks, and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. The Last of Us Part 1 at its Ultra preset is one of the most VRAM heavy games out there, and as we've seen with some other PlayStation 5 exclusives. Anyway, at 1080p Ultra, we are seeing the 4060 Ti only 15% faster than the 3060 12GB in both the averages and the 1% lows. The 3060 12GB is able to play at 60 frames per second. The 4060 Ti is up around 69 nice FPS. However, we do see that 3060 12GB is going a little over 8GB allocation, and I do think that was bringing them closer together. By dropping down to the high preset, it reins in a lot of the VRAM usage. We can see now that even the 3060, which has more than 8, is not trying to allocate more than 8 and is only reporting usage of about 6. And now the 4060 Ti is 38% faster on the averages and 10% in the 1% lows, with the 3060 getting a respectable mid-70 average and the 4060 Ti up around 100 FPS. So we can see that when not constrained by VRAM spillover, the 4060 Ti is a lot faster than the 3060. However, what if we increase the resolution, which also increases VRAM, and go back to the Ultra preset? At 1440p Ultra, the 4060 Ti is only 10% faster than the 3060 12GB, and it's actually losing in the 1% lows, with the 3060 6% faster. And, you know, while I would personally probably tweak settings to get 60 frames per second, in a game at this pace, playing this game at 40 frames per second, which is what the 3060 is doing here, is not unreasonable. It's a bit of a shame to see the 4060 Ti not able to handle those settings when it seems like it otherwise could have if it had more VRAM. Now, another way to rein in VRAM capacity a little bit, VRAM usage a little bit, is to upscale using DLSS quality at 1440p Ultra. We see the 3060 able to deliver right around a 60 frames per second experience, just a little bit below. The 4060 Ti is faster, up into the 70s, and it has a 24% lead on the averages and a 15% in the 1% lows, but it seems like it would have had a larger lead if it wasn't held back by its VRAM capacity. Which we can also see here as we turn down to the high preset. At 1440p high settings, these are designed to stay within an 8GB VRAM buffer, and now we see the 4060 Ti winning by 32% on average and 26% in the 1% lows. The 3060 12GB is able to handle around 50 frames per second, and the 4060 Ti is up in the around 66, 67 frames per second. Overall, it's putting up a good 1440p experience, but again, it seems like it could have maybe handled the Ultra settings if we had more VRAM on the card. Now, not that you're really going to play either of these at these settings, but I tested 4K Ultra just to see if we could get the 3060 a lead, and sure enough, we do. The 3060 is winning by 5% on average, and it's 6 times faster in the 1% lows. However, that's going from 3 to 18, so this is really a Pyrrhic victory, or maybe you could say it's winning in a murder-suicide. It did kill the 4060 Ti, but it kind of killed its own performance as well, so that's not particularly useful numbers, but it was interesting to see that the 3060 can pull ahead, even if at unreasonable settings. Again, these aren't really 4K GPUs, but at the high setting, they're both at least a little more usable, although still not how I'd use it. I'd probably upscale as well using DLSS. But anyway, at 4K high, the 4060 Ti is back on top by 28% in the averages, but the 3060 is winning by 28% in the 1% lows. It's a little bit stuttery there. Let's move on to another PlayStation 5 exclusive that has been ported to PC. This is Forspoken at its maximum preset, which does include ray tracing and is also very VRAM heavy. Despite being so VRAM heavy, we do see the 4060 Ti come out ahead by 24% on average, but if you see certain scenes like the one we're looking at now, the two GPUs are actually performing very similarly, and there are moments where the 3060 is ahead. So it really just depends on, I think, how much VRAM each particular scene is using. And going up to 1440p resolution, we see the 4060 Ti now winning by 14% on average, so not far ahead of its last gen and lower tier predecessor. And in certain scenes, once again, it kind of swings pretty wildly depending on the overall VRAM usage. We can see the 3060 here reporting 10 gigabytes of allocation and about 10 gigabytes of actual usage. Now, going up to 4K resolution, once again, is kind of an unreasonable thing to do. But once again, I was just curious for science what would happen. Does the 3060 come out ahead of the 4060 Ti? It sure does. It gets a 12% lead by the end of the benchmark run. But once again, it doesn't really matter that it's ahead here when the overall performance is down in the teens. So, it is technically a win for the 3060, but not at settings that anybody would actually be using. Let's test out another PlayStation 5 exclusive that's been ported to PC. This one is called Returnal. And at its 1080p Epic preset, it doesn't use that much VRAM, only around 5 or 6 gigabytes. And that means that the 4060 Ti is able to show off its actual just raw performance lead of 41% on average and 21% in the 1% lows. Both GPUs giving a good experience, 69 average on the 3060, nice, and about 97 on the 4060 Ti. Moving up to 1440p Epic preset, they are once again not using that much VRAM. So not every PlayStation 5 game is super VRAM heavy. And we're seeing the 4060 Ti ahead by 41% on the averages and now 47% in the 1% lows. The 3060 is averaging around 51 FPS, and the 4060 Ti is able to average around 72 FPS by the end of the benchmark run, so very usable there at 1440p. And at 4K Epic settings, we're still not going over an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, which means the 4060 Ti is still ahead by 41%. And 40% in the 1% lows. The 3060 is giving an almost 30 FPS average, whereas the 4060 Ti is giving closer to a 40 FPS average. So in reality, with both GPUs, I would turn down settings and probably use DLSS, but it's somewhat playable on both. Now let's move into some cross-platform games. And let's go with some of the latest. This is Star Wars Jedi Survivor at its maximum settings 1080p, so Epic preset with ray tracing turned on. This game can be VRAM heavy, although it's looking like at this point, the 3060 is reporting a little bit of over 8 gigabytes of allocation, but it doesn't seem to be causing any major issues for the 4060 Ti. Which is winning by 40% on averages and 29% in the 1% lows. The 3060 is averaging a little over 50 FPS at these settings, and the 4060 Ti is averaging up in the 70s with these settings. But what if we turn down the settings and turn off ray tracing? Well, now the 3060 is able to average well over 60 frames per second. The 4060 Ti is actually pushing in towards 100 frames per second. And this is giving the 4060 Ti a 44% lead on average and a 35% lead in the 1% lows. So overall, both GPUs can perform very, very well here by turning down the settings and turning off the ray tracing implementation. So, and also the 3060 is not reporting over 8 gigabytes of VRAM allocation even. However, what if we go up to 1440p at the Epic preset with ray tracing on? So we're back up to the maximum settings. At these settings, the 3060 is reporting an allocation of more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but the per process usage is hanging out right around 8 gigabytes. But this doesn't seem to be causing any issues on the 4060 Ti. It has a 46% lead on the average and 41% in the 1% lows. Overall performance on the 3060 is usable if you're targeting like a 30 FPS lock. It's around 35 average. The 4060 Ti much more playable at 51. Now, at 1440p can be a lot more manageable if we turn off ray tracing and drop down to the high preset. By doing that, we now see the 4060 Ti averaging over 60 frames per second, and we see the 3060 averaging over 40 frames per second, and we're not seeing any issues going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and the 4060 Ti is winning by 46% on average and 38% in the 1% lows. So overall, at the high settings, both GPUs doing pretty well here, although on the 3060, you might want to turn things down a little bit more or upscale. At 4K, I'm just looking at the high preset. I didn't even bother with Epic with ray tracing on. Again, 4K in and of itself, probably not anybody's actual use case, but thought I'd once again look at it for science. Here we're seeing the 3060 around 20 frames per second, and the 4060 Ti actually hanging out right around 30 frames per second at 4K high, and we're not. We are seeing the 3060 reporting about 9 gigabytes of allocation and close to 8 of usage. The 4060 Ti is winning by 48% though, and 37% in the 1% lows, so it doesn't seem to be causing it any sort of meaningful problems. Now let's jump into A Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p Ultra. This game is not super VRAM heavy, but is one of the best looking games I've seen from the current gen exclusive games. And the 4060 Ti is winning by 45% average and 48% in the 1% lows. The 4060 Ti averaging a little over 80 FPS in this benchmark, and the 3060 actually a little under 60 FPS. Through this benchmark run. I use kind of the little opening cutscene of the game as my main benchmark for this. Now, if we go up to 1440p resolution and leave things at the Ultra preset, the 4060 Ti is now under 60 frames per second, and the 3060 is under 40 frames per second. But the VRAM usage is under 5 gigabytes, and so the 4060 Ti has a 42% lead and a 43% lead in the 1% lows. So both of them might want to look into using upscaling there, though, to be honest. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into Unreal Engine 5. So I'm using Fortnite, and I'm using its replay feature to capture side-by-side gameplay. Fortnite has been upgraded to Unreal Engine 5, including all of the features like Lumen lighting system and Nanite, virtual shadow maps, all of that. And at 1080p max settings, so Epic with the hardware accelerated Lumen ray tracing turned on, we see the 4060 Ti averaging right around 62 frames per second, the 3060 down at 45. It's a 40% lead for the 4060 Ti. If we drop down to the high settings and turn off hardware accelerated ray tracing, we now see the 3060 able to give us over 70 frames per second, and the 4060 Ti actually closing in up over 90 frames per second, getting near 100 frames per second averages. It's a 39% lead for the 4060 Ti and a 32% lead in the 1% lows. So both GPUs do a lot better by having the settings turned down to high rather than Epic with the ray tracing turned on. However, if we turn Epic and settings and ray tracing back on and go up to 1440p resolution, we still don't see VRAM becoming an issue, although overall performance isn't great on either card, with the 3060 averaging around 30 frames per second, the 4060 Ti around 42 frames per second, giving it a 36% lead over the older card and a 39% lead in the 1% lows. And I don't know why my replay will sometimes show the gun scope in and sometimes not. It's kind of frustrating, but it shouldn't be affecting the overall averages too much. Anyway, what if we kept the maximum settings like Epic with ray tracing on at 1440p, but we used DLSS quality upscaling to try to get some performance back? With those settings, the 4060 Ti is able to average a little over 60 frames per second. And the 3060 is now a lot more playable, up in around 47 frames per second. Still not getting 60 on that card. It's a 32% lead for the 4060 Ti on average. And if we, instead of upscaling, keep a native 1440p resolution, but turn off ray tracing and go down to the high preset, we now see the 4060 Ti up over 60, actually around 67 frames per second, and the 3060 12GB just shy of 50 frames per second, giving the 4060 Ti a 36% lead on average and a 34% lead in the 1% lows. So they're certainly both playable here, and if you needed more frames, you could also once again kick in DLSS with the high settings as the baseline. But oh my goodness, if you turn on 4K resolution, epic settings with ray tracing on, not that you'd really ever use it, you can make the 4060 Ti stutter to an absolute slideshow, literally 1 frame per second. It does end up actually recovering, but that did happen several times throughout the benchmark run. I just show you guys a little clip of what I test. It was bad, and now the clips are actually out of sync with each other and all of that. But overall, the averages are a 31% lead for the 3060, but the 1% lows were just something else because of that stuttering slideshow that we got there for a bit. Now let's jump into some cross-gen games like Resident Evil 4 Remake at its 1080p maximum preset, which does include some ray tracing. We see both GPUs playable, over 60 FPS on the 3060 and over 90 FPS on the 4060 Ti. The 4060 Ti is winning by 45% on averages, but only 14% in the 1% lows, and I have a feeling that that could be VRAM related, as the 3060 is reporting 9 gigabytes of usage and 10 gigabytes of allocation. And moving up to 1440p resolution, again at the maximum preset, which includes ray tracing, we now see some more stutters happening on the frame time graph for the 4060 Ti, and its 1% lows are terrible, with the 3060 over 3 times as fast in the 1% lows, although the 4060 Ti still technically wins on average by 17%, but the 3060 is delivering a much more consistent experience throughout the benchmark run. Going up to 4K resolution with the maximum preset, we're now seeing, once again, a bit of an issue on the 1% lows as we get some stuttering on the 4060 Ti, allowing the 3060 to have more than double the average on the 1% lows, but on the overall average frame rate, the 4060 Ti is winning by 24% by the end of the benchmark run, because when it isn't stuttering, it is running at a higher speed. But both of these GPUs are around 30 frames per second anyway, so again, they're not really 4K GPUs, that's more for science. Now, let's move into Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at the 1080p balanced preset, not the extreme preset, because that's a little more realistic to how people would actually play the game. Here we see the 4060 Ti get it the biggest lead we've seen overall, 52% on average, 56% in the 1% lows, and I have just noticed in general that this game really does seem to like the 4060 Ti, and in general like some of the 40 series GPUs with, I think it's the larger L2 cache. That's my personal theory, is that this game really likes the L2 cache. Moving up to 1440p balance, we see the 4060 Ti winning by 54% on average and 64% in the 1% lows. 4060 Ti averaging over 120 FPS, with the 3060 closer to 80. So certainly a much more competitive experience at 1440p on the 4060 Ti in this game. By the way, some people are always like, why do you benchmark Modern Warfare 2 and not Warzone 2? They're using the same graphics engine, so the GPU relative performance is going to be the same. The main difference is Warzone 2 as a battle royale, it doesn't have a built-in benchmark, and actually getting good side-by-sides is very difficult. Also, its CPU usage can be more of a factor if you have a lot of players in the area, that kind of a thing. But anyway, GPU relative performance is much the same. If you were curious, at 4K resolution, the 4060 Ti is still actually doing pretty well there. Now, let's move into Cyberpunk 2077, and while my main use of this game is going to be as a heavy ray tracing benchmark, I thought we would also take a look at just the non-ray traced 1080p Ultra settings, where we see the 4060 Ti with a 34% lead on averages and 29% in the 1% lows. It is averaging close to 100 FPS, and the 3060 12GB is over 70, so they both give a good experience at 1080p Ultra, but a much higher refresh rate experience on the 4060 Ti. Moving up to the 1440p Ultra settings, we now see the 4060 Ti still hanging on to over 60 FPS on average, whereas the 3060 12GB drops into the mid-40s, which is certainly playable, but you'd be better advised to drop settings and probably upscale as well. This is a 38% lead for the 4060 Ti on average, and a 38% lead also in the 1% lows. But let's go ahead and turn on Ray Tracing Ultra preset. This is not the Path Tracing RT Overdrive, but just Ray Tracing at the Ultra settings. And here we see a 47% lead on average for the 4060 Ti and a 36% in the 1% lows. The 3060 12GB does average around 30 FPS, but it does drop below that a lot. The 4060 Ti is much more playable, up in the mid-40s average, and the 1% lows above 30. However, I think a lot of people would want to turn down settings, maybe use some upscaling, maybe even use some frame generation. If you're on the 4060 Ti, we shouldn't leave off that this exists. Using the DLSS quality preset, the 3060 is able to boost its performance to much more playable, near 50 FPS. The 4060 Ti, using upscaling DLSS quality, is able to get over 70 FPS. And then if you also kick on frame generation, it can then go well over 100 off of that baseline, but there's some caveats there. Without frame generation, it's a 47% lead on average, 42% in the 1% lows. Now, I'm showing the latency counter at the very bottom of the screen. You can see that enabling frame generation does increase input latency a little bit. It also can have some more further image quality artifacts. However, I've found that if your base frame rate is as high as we're seeing here, up around 70, the latency still feels pretty good in a single player game, and I don't see a lot of image quality artifacts. So I actually do think that the screen on the right there does show a compelling way to play this game, although in general, upscaling at 1080p isn't my favorite thing to do. Let's get some final thoughts with some numbers behind me. So first of all, MSRPs compared of $399 versus $329. We're seeing that the 4060 Ti is about 21% more expensive and does usually offer more than 21% more performance, but sometimes actually, well, less than that, especially when it is hampered by its VRAM situation, like we saw in a bunch of our benchmarks. So in other words, it can offer better price to performance than the 3060 did at its launch, 2.5 years later, but sometimes doesn't when it's constrained by its VRAM, because again, it has significantly less VRAM than its less expensive predecessor. Now, also, we can compare the current price versus the current price. If buying new, so 380 versus 280 is 36% more expensive. And are we usually getting 36% more performance? Well, you can see, like when we turn down to the high settings in The Last of Us Part 1, it's about 38% faster, less than that in the 1% lows, things like that. So that's at least roughly even price to performance scaling. Although again, when it spills over its VRAM capacity, it's worse than that. And again, this is comparing it against an older card, although it is discounted at this point. And then it gets worse than that when you compare it against buying something like the 3060s are widely available used now, and you could get one for, like I said, at today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, $230. Something like that. And if you compare the $380 versus $230, it's now 65% more expensive. Granted, we're comparing new versus used, which isn't entirely fair, but is a realistic buying consideration. 65% more expensive, and we never saw it offer 65% more performance. It was, like I said, frequently quite a bit less, and when spilling over VRAM capacity, sometimes not even really much faster at all. So overall, this, I think, does illustrate why a lot of people are hesitant to buy the 4060 Ti, especially if you already had upgraded to something like a 3060. Is it offering you that much in the way of additional features and all of that? Well, you do get AV1 encoding, you do get better energy efficiency, like up here we can see 100 watts versus 150 watts in this particular test there. So it is more energy efficient while delivering better performance. Again, AV1 encoding could matter for some people, but for a lot of people it doesn't. If you're not streaming or encoding videos with AV1, then it doesn't really matter that much. Then the last thing we have is frame generation, which I did test out at the very end of the test. And again, frame generation is a nice to have but fairly situational feature. It's not useful in competitive games because it does increase the PC latency. It's is useful in single player games if, like I said, you can get to a high enough baseline frame rate that the latency still feels pretty good, and there aren't a lot of image quality artifacts. So it's a nice to have but situational feature that I do think is worth considering if you play a lot of mostly single player games. But man, I really just think, let me ask you guys a whole different question though. What if we had been looking at all of these tests, but what if we lived in a world where the 4060 Ti wasn't a 4060 Ti? What if it was exactly the same performance that we're seeing here, but what if it was called a 4060? And what if it came in at $329 like its predecessor? I think people would be a lot more excited about it. I think a lot of people would still be like, but it has less VRAM. Although we did see that even when it spills over its VRAM capacity, it is still usually a little bit faster unless you push things to ridiculous levels, like going up to 4K max settings, things like that. And in a lot of games, like we're seeing here with Returnal, it's quite a bit faster and stays well within its VRAM usage. If we lived in that kind of clicking the wrong buttons again. If we lived in that kind of a hypothetical world where this wasn't a 4060 Ti, this was a 4060, and it came in at $329 or maybe even $299 because it has less VRAM, then I think people would be a lot more excited about it. I still don't think they'd be completely blown away and would still be annoyed by the lack of VRAM, but I think it would be a lot more compelling than what we got here. I think in general, NVIDIA has tried to push the product stack to give bigger names to cards that have hardware that don't really deserve those bigger names. This 4060 Ti probably could have been called a 4060 or even a 4050, and a lot of people wouldn't have batted an eye at that when you look at its actual hardware levels. I think NVIDIA was banking on things like frame generation to make up the difference, but the thing is, because that's situational, a lot of people are buying their GPUs for competitive gaming, or they're buying it, maybe for single player games, but not every game supports it. All sorts of reasons why you can't just call frame generation increased raw performance, because of all the situations where it's either not supported or doesn't work well or isn't useful in competitive situations, that kind of a thing. Anyway, what do you guys think about all of this? If you already have a 3060, are you considering upgrading to a 4060 Ti based on what you saw in this video? To me, it certainly seems like, well, yeah, it can get you a decent performance jump. There's enough situations where it doesn't that it would maybe be like, let's hang on and see what the next gen has to offer, or consider jumping to seeing what maybe Team Red has to offer. I've already compared the 4060 Ti and the 3060 12GB against some interesting AMD competition, like the 6700 XT, which is a 12GB card and is significantly faster than a 3060. It doesn't usually beat the 4060 Ti, but does cost a lot less money. That might be a more interesting comparison point for a lot of people. And if you're considering upgrading to either of these cards, again, the 4060 Ti certainly is faster, especially when it's not reined in by its VRAM, draws less energy, has more, newer technologies, all of that. But the 3060, when you can buy it, used for $230, spending $400 on that 4060 Ti, you might want to think about that. And again, consider a whole bunch of other alternatives. And again, take a look at jawa.gg and the link in the pinned comment and video description to both sell your current hardware to fund your upgrade and take a look at their both new and used offers along with their completed gaming PCs. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.